In 1848, on Isle Royale, a long forested island rising out of the cold water of Lake Superior, a mining agent named Samuel O. Knapp was directing a crew for the Minnesota Mining Company, one of a dozen outfits that had leased claims across the island that year, chasing rumors of a copper vein rich enough to work without smelting, pure metal you could cut with a knife straight out of the rock. Knapp's men were following a vein when their picks broke through into open space, an old excavation already there ahead of them, its walls too regular to be a natural fracture. At the bottom, under standing water, lay a mass of native copper too large for any man to lift, resting across a cradle of wooden timbers someone had clearly built to raise it. The wood had sat submerged so long it had gone the texture of soft cheese, and yet the grain and the axe marks on it were still there to be read. Knapp's crew sank the shaft another 20 feet past that point, 40 feet down in all, and still could not free the mass or explain who had put the timbers there or how long ago. Nobody had smelted this copper, and nobody had blasted this rock. Something with only stone and fire and human patience had gotten this far, and then stopped. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Knapp had broken into was not an isolated hole in the ground. Isle Royale is honeycombed with them, more than 1,000 shallow pits recorded by surveyors over the following decades, strung for miles along a spine of high rock called Minong Ridge, where a band of copper-bearing basalt runs close to the surface. Compare these depressions to what 19th century miners left behind with dynamite, and the difference stands out immediately. Blasted rock breaks in sharp, angular chunks, while these pits are rounded and smooth-sided, the kind of shape that only comes from thousands of individual blows landing over years, not days. Most run no more than a few feet across and a foot or two deep, though some go far deeper where a rich vein pulled the work downward, the way it pulled Knapp's men down to 40 feet. Two geologists, John Foster and Josiah Whitney, examined a cluster of these workings in 1850 and settled the question of whether nature could have made them. The pits, they concluded, were unmistakably the product of human labor. Inside them, and scattered on the ground around them, lay the tools, hand-sized cobbles of hard local stone, some grooved for hafting to a handle, battered flat and cratered on their striking faces from repeated use. Around the larger copper masses, still lodged in the rock, excavators found drifts of small copper chips, thin, curved, hammered flakes, exactly the kind of debris that piles up when someone pounds a soft metal nugget against a hard surface over and over. There is no furnace anywhere on this island, no crucible, no slag, because none was needed. Copper here occurs in its native metallic form, not locked inside ore that has to be smelted free. The miners built fires against the rock to heat it, then doused it with water to crack the stone along its grain, a technique called fire setting, and afterward went at the loosened rock with their hammerstones until a piece of copper broke free clean enough to carry off. Once freed, the metal was never melted. It was worked cold, and periodically annealed by heating it just enough to keep it from cracking as it was hammered thinner, folded, and shaped into knives, spear points, awls, and bracelets. Picture what a camera moving along Minong Ridge today would still find: a shallow trench running along the spine of the rock, its rounded lip half filled with a century and a half of pine needles and drifted soil, indistinguishable at a glance from a natural dip in the ground, until you notice how many of them there are, spaced with a rough regularity, one after another, for miles. Kneel at the edge of one, and the difference from dynamite work becomes obvious even to an untrained eye. No sharp faces, no angular rubble, only that smoothed, worn-down quality that comes from thousands of patient blows, landing in roughly the same places. The hammerstones themselves look almost featureless at a glance, fist-sized cobbles any hiker might kick aside, until you turn one over and see the crater battered into one face, and the groove pecked around its middle, where a wooden handle or a wrapped cord was once lashed on. Multiply that stone by the thousands recovered since the 1860s, and you are looking at generations of hands replacing the same worn tool over and over on the same ridge. It is, by any honest measure, a metal industry, sustained across a stretch of time longer than the distance between us and the pyramids of Giza, using a technology that required no melting point, no bellows, and no written record to pass down. That longevity is where the plain physical description stops answering questions and starts raising them. The first systematic attempt to put this discovery on the record came from Charles Whittlesey, the state geologist of Ohio, who mapped the pits of the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale in 1862 and published a fuller account the following year through the Smithsonian Institution. Whittlesey described the workings exactly as later observers would: shallow, rounded, running for miles, empty of slag, full of stone hammers. His report went further than a map. He walked the pits himself, measured a sample of them by hand, and noted how consistently they clustered along the outcrop, rather than scattering randomly across the island. Direct evidence, he argued, that whoever dug them understood exactly where the copper-bearing rock ran below the surface, and returned to the same productive stretches again and again, rather than digging blind. That kind of geological reading, applied consistently across an island some 45 miles long, is itself a form of transmitted knowledge, passed from one generation of miners to the next, long enough to outlast any individual human memory. Whittlesey offered no date for any of it, because in 1863 no method existed that could give him one. That method did not exist for nearly another century. In 1960 and 1961, an archaeologist named Tyler Bastian, working for the University of Michigan, excavated several of the pits and recovered charcoal from the fill, material burned in the fire-setting process and left behind. Radiocarbon testing placed that charcoal at roughly 3,360 to 2,880 years before the Common Era, among the oldest confirmed dates for organized copper extraction anywhere in the world at that time. More recent work has pushed the story earlier still. Researchers studying sediment cores pulled from Macargo Cove on Isle Royale itself found chemical traces of mining activity in layers laid down between roughly 6,500 and 5,400 years ago, evidence written into the mud of the lake bottom rather than into any tool or shaft. What has never firmed up is the picture of who organized any of it. The National Park Service, which now oversees the pits on Isle Royale, states plainly that with more than 1,000 shafts dug across a span of at least 1,500 years, there is no basis for assuming any single, highly organized effort behind the work. How such demanding, repeated labor sustained itself for 15 centuries without the kind of centralized authority, monumental architecture, or written administration that accompanies mining at this scale almost everywhere else in the ancient world, remains an open question in the archaeological literature, not a settled one. Two archaeologists, Susan Martin of Michigan Technological University and Thomas Pleger, published a paper in 1999 with a title that says as much as its argument, "The Complex Formerly Known as a Culture." Their point was that decades of scholarship had quietly folded together separate communities, separate centuries, and separate traditions of working this copper into one tidy label, old copper culture, because a single label was easier to teach than the messier truth underneath it. For a long stretch of the 19th century, that messier truth was buried under something worse than convenience. Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, who in 1848 produced the very first volume the Smithsonian Institution ever published on the ancient earthworks of the Mississippi Valley, concluded that the people who built the great mounds of Ohio and the Mississippi Basin were a race distinct from, and by their account more advanced than, the American Indians living among those same earthworks. That verdict, extended without much scrutiny to the copper workings of Lake Superior, held for decades. A vanished race of mound builders, connected in various tellings to Toltecs, to a lost tribe, to almost anyone but the ancestors of the people already living there. Even within the 19th century, some observers pushed back. A writer surveying the Isle Royale pits for Popular Science Monthly in 1881 called the wall built between the historic Indian and the ancient mound builder wholly imaginary once it was actually examined closely. It took the accumulation of controlled excavation, radiocarbon dating, and continuity of craft tradition across the 20th century to settle the question the way Squire and Davis never did. These mines were the work of the direct ancestors of the Ojibwe and related Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes, whose descendants were still guiding 19th century prospectors to old copper lodes generations later and explaining, in words later borrowed for one archaeologist's book title, the metal's wonderful power. 20th century fieldwork turned up something else that complicates the tidy picture. Almost no large, permanent settlements sit directly beside the densest fields of pits. Excavators have found small camps, hearths, occasional burials, and scatters of tools consistent with people staying on the island for a season and then leaving, not year-round villages supporting a resident labor force across generations. That absence has produced the leading working explanation among archaeologists today that the mining was seasonal, carried out in warmer months by task groups who traveled to the island specifically for it and returned to larger communities on the mainland once the ore they could carry was in hand, passing knowledge of specific pits and veins down through families or bands across centuries rather than through any central authority. It is a plausible model, and it is also, by the admission of the archaeologists who hold it, a model built mostly on absence, on what has not been found near the pits, rather than on direct evidence of how the work was actually organized, season to season, across 1,500 years or more. The gap is honestly reported in the literature. It has simply never been filled. Scale is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to read past a number like 1,000 pits without feeling the size of it. If a handful of workers used one pit at a time for even a portion of a single season, and if that pattern repeated across a workable season for 1,500 years or longer, the individual work hours involved climb into the hundreds of thousands, carried out with cobblestones and fire, on an island reachable only by open water crossing, for a period longer than recorded history in most of the world. Whittlesey counted the hammerstones by the wagon load. Later collectors counted them by the ton. Nobody has ever finished counting the pits themselves with total confidence, because new ones are still being mapped. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The copper did not stay on Isle Royale. Roughly 2,000 years ago, more than 700 miles to the south and east, in the Scioto River Valley of southern Ohio, communities archaeologists call the Hopewell were burying large quantities of worked copper inside their mounds, sheet breastplates, ear spools, effigies of birds and animals, panpipes, a single cache at one mound site holding more than 100 individual pieces. For more than a century, the assumption in the literature was that this copper had come from the Lake Superior Basin, an assumption resting more on geography than on direct testing. That changed when archaeologists began running laser ablation mass spectrometry on the metal itself, comparing trace element signatures in the finished Hopewell artifacts against samples taken from known source deposits. The results, published from work on Scioto Valley sites, confirmed the old assumption for most of the copper and gave it a precision the assumption never had. The majority of the artifacts matched Great Lakes sources, and among those, the single largest group matched Isle Royale specifically, the same ridge where Knapp's crew broke into that flooded shaft. Mark Seaman, an archaeologist at Kent State University who led related research into Hopewell copper acquisition, has argued that pieces of this size and consistency were unlikely to have simply drifted south through casual trade between neighboring groups. Getting the largest, purest masses out of the Lake Superior country and into Ohio, he suggests, required people to travel there directly and carry it back themselves, a purposeful and difficult journey rather than an accident of exchange. Not every mound tells the same story, and that inconsistency matters more than a clean pattern would. At the Mound City site, one of the largest Hopewell ceremonial centers, roughly 42% of the copper tested traces instead to the southern Appalachians, a source hundreds of miles in the opposite direction, drawing on an entirely different supply line, one with no earlier record of use before the Hopewell period. So the same culture, building mounds a few miles apart in the same river valley, was drawing metal from two separate copper-producing regions of the continent at the same time, maintaining both routes simultaneously, rather than settling on one. Between the Lake Superior copper country and the Scioto Valley of southern Ohio lie hundreds of miles of forest, river crossings, and terrain with no continuous road of any kind for centuries to come. A canoe route down connected waterways could shorten parts of the journey, but the portages between river systems still had to be walked, carrying whatever copper the party had already freed on top of food, tools, and everything else an expedition of that length required. There is no evidence of pack animals suited to the task anywhere in the archaeological record of this period in North America. Every pound of that metal moved because a person carried it, and the tradition behind all of it did not begin with the Hopewell. It was already ancient by the time Hopewell metalworkers were shaping ear spools in Ohio. Northeastern Minnesota, well outside Isle Royale, carries its own strand of the same story. At a site called Sandy Lake Dam, archaeologists working stratified deposits recovered copper artifacts from a layer independently dated to well over 6,000 years before the present, a mainland tradition running parallel to the island shafts rather than descending from them, evidence that people across a wide stretch of the upper Midwest were independently arriving at the same relationship with this metal at roughly the same remote period. Put the pieces beside each other: the flooded shaft on Isle Royale, the ridge of 1,000 pits, the breastplates in Ohio mounds sourced by mass spectrometry back to that same ridge, the parallel tradition in Minnesota older than Stonehenge, and a shape starts to emerge that no single site can show on its own. Not one mine and one mystery, but a metal economy spanning a large portion of a continent, sustained for thousands of years, run by people the written record did not begin taking seriously until the middle of the 20th century. Almost none of what made this possible required anything we would now call a state. No known written language recorded who owned a pit, who was owed a debt of copper, or who had the right to work a given stretch of Minong Ridge in a given year. What survives instead is the labor itself, preserved in stone and metal, because stone and metal do not rot. The pits are still there, more than 1,000 of them, protected today within Isle Royale National Park, walkable along the same ridge where Foster and Whitney stood in 1850, and where Whittlesey drew his map a decade later. Isle Royale itself is not an easy place to reach even now. It sits closer to the shoreline of Canada and upper Minnesota than to any major 19th century port, and the crossing that stranded Knapp's crew there for a working season is the same open, frequently rough stretch of water that still limits the island to a seasonal national park today, reachable only by boat or seaplane, closed most of the year. The hammerstones Whittlesey counted by the wagon load are scattered through university and state collections across the upper Great Lakes, most still uncatalogued individually, too numerous for any single museum to hold. What became of the specific mass of copper Knapp's crew uncovered in 1848, whether it was ever fully freed, sold, melted down for industrial use, or left in place beneath later mining debris, is not consistently recorded across the sources that mention it at all, and that gap is honest rather than suspicious. A great deal of 19th century industrial record-keeping simply did not think a prehistoric artifact worth tracking once the modern vein beneath it was open for business. What can be said without hedging is narrower, and for that reason more solid. People without smelting, without draft animals, without a script, organized themselves well enough to sink more than 1,000 shafts along a single ridge, to keep at that work for at least 15 centuries, and very possibly closer to 6,000 years, to move the finest of what they freed as far as 750 miles to the southeast, and to do all of it a very long time before 19th century scholars were willing to credit their direct descendants with any of it. The wood beneath that copper mass on Isle Royale had gone as soft as cheese by 1848, but the grain was still there, and the axe marks were still there, put there by hands with a plan sophisticated enough to try to raise several tons of solid metal out of solid rock, using nothing but timber and leverage. They did not finish the job. Whoever they were, something interrupted the work before the mass came free, and it sat there, submerged and undisturbed, until another set of hands broke through by accident, looking for something else entirely. The shaft is still 40 feet deep. The ridge still holds more than 1,000 pits nobody has finished counting. And the copper that did leave that island is still sitting, catalogued now down to its trace elements, inside the mounds where people who never saw Lake Superior chose, 2,000 years ago, to bury it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.